Hello and welcome to today's History Podcast. Now, this video is going to concern kind of the end point of the treaties that we've been looking at that were signed at the end of World War I in 1919. And we're going to look at these treaties and ask the question, were the treaties justified? As in, were they fair? So after the signings of these treaties, were they justified, were they fair? And a lot of debate has happened in the last 100 years about these treaties and asking the question, were they fair or not? And opinions change and people's viewpoints differ a lot of the time, and there's lots of different interpretations. Now, one of the few accepted interpretations is this one, that the Germans absolutely hated the Treaty of Versailles. There's no doubt that Germans and the other countries like Austria and Hungary, most of their populations absolutely hated the treaties that were given to them. So they hated it. And a lot of opinion has been based around certain historians like Keynes and Nicholson's. So historical opinion has been based around these guys who were at the Paris Peace Conference, and they were quite negative, especially towards the Treaty of Versailles. And to sum up the German opinion, and also kind of the opinions of Keynes and Nicholson, it was this speech made by a German MP in the Reichstag in 1919. The criminal madness of this peace will drain Germany's national lifeblood. It is a shameless blow in the face of common sense. It is inflicting the deepest wounds on us Germans as our world lies in wreckage about us. So obviously this viewpoint is extremely negative towards the treaties. They're calling it shameless, inflicting the deepest wounds, wreckage, there's no common sense. It's completely negative towards the Treaty of Versailles. And it's obviously going to be, because it's from a German's point of view. But there were also British point of views, like Keynes and Nicholson's, who felt that they'd messed up with the treaty and were saying, like David Lloyd George, that another war was just going to happen again in the future. And a lot of people just accept that, yeah, the Treaty of Versailles was bad and it caused World War II. Okay, to an extent it did, but we have to make sure, at the time, were the treaties justified? As in, was it the best they could do? So the first place we're going to start is looking at the criticisms for the Treaty of Versailles and the other treaties. So the treaty of this one is what is taught in a curriculum in the state of Michigan, and this is kind of like an example and then the kind of accepted view that people are taught in schools throughout Britain as well. The Treaty of Versailles was flawed. So flawed to the extent that instead of preventing future wars, it made a future war inevitable. So it's saying it was the cause for World War II, and that's kind of like the accepted view of many schools. Now this one is from Dan Morehouse, who's a teacher, and he wrote in 2004, something created so quickly and in an environment as hostile as the immediate aftermath of the bloodiest war of all time was bound to be filled with clauses created more through fear and anger than forgiveness, compassion, and a desire for rebuilding relationships and really ensuring long-lasting peace. So he's saying, look, the main problem with the Treaty of Versailles is that it was created after the bloodiest war of all time. So it's going to be filled with clauses to do with fear and anger, and they're not going to be forgiving or compassionate. Okay, and they're not going to be rebuilding friendships and relationships. They're just going to be too harsh. So the idea is that the Treaty of Versailles was created too quickly. It was just completely harsh and over the top and didn't do anybody any favours. And that's kind of like a general viewpoint that of most people nowadays, that it was harsh and that it caused a lot of future problems like World War II. But can we just say that? Can that just be the only opinion? And as historians, we have to look at the lots of different sides of the argument. And a lot of people feel that the Treaty of Versailles was justified. Okay? So here's a few historians who have justified the Treaty of Versailles. And this is by Wolfgang Mommsen, who's a historian at the University of Dusseldorf, and he's a German, obviously written after the war, after World War II, but still, it's a justification. So basically, I think one can say the treaty was harsh, but understandable. The Allied governments were under the pressure of their own public, which demanded the Germans to pay for it all. So he's kind of saying, look, it was harsh, but what else could the big three do? As we've looked from the other videos, the big three were constantly under a lot of pressure from their own population. Britain, France and the USA, all their people were saying Germany needs to be punished, especially the French, who were saying Germany needs to be punished more than anyone had ever been punished before. And we've looked at that. And so the justification for the Treaty of Versailles was, well, the big three and the leaders at the Paris Peace Conference were doing what the whole of people at the time wanted. Okay? They gave the people what they wanted, and which was for the Germans to pay for it all. And here's another justification then. This is by a British historian, W. Carr, in his book A History of Germany, written in 1972. Severe as the treaty seemed to many Germans, it should be remembered that Germany might have fared much worse. If Clemenceau had had his way, the Rhineland would have become an independent state, the Saar would have become part of France, and Danzig would have become part of Poland. So he's saying, look, the Treaty of Versailles actually wasn't that harsh if you think about it. You have to remember that Clemenceau had wanted it to be even harsher, to have an independent Rhineland, to make sure that the Tsar became part of France, and that Danzig would become part of Poland. So he's kind of saying, look, the Treaty of Versailles was actually a pretty good deal for Germans, and that in the end it could have been a hell of a lot worse. Right, so in fact, they're kind of like the justifications of the Treaty of Versailles, but in fact there's also even praise for the Treaty of Versailles. And I think this is quite a good viewpoint to consider when it comes to how the Big Three and the rest of the leaders put the treaty together in 1919. So, this is Richard Jones Nerzik in 2004. 3 European empires had collapsed, economies were devastated, millions of people were homeless or victims of disease, and nationalist and communist revolutions were breaking out all over Europe. The peacemakers, so the Big Three, had to act quickly to save their world, and in this they were remarkably successful. So Jones Nerzik is saying, look, they had a massive amounts of stress put on them at the Paris Peace Conference. They needed to sort out Europe, and in the end, this is the best thing that could have happened. They sorted it out quickly in 5 to 6 months, and in fact, it did bring stability for about 20 years. You know, at the time, they had to sort it out because, look, 3 European empires had collapsed. German Empire had collapsed, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Russia itself had collapsed and become communist, which is what's down here, communist revolutions like in Russia. Economies were devastated. Millions of people were homeless or victims of disease. And, the peacemakers had to act quickly to save their world. And in fact, we can say, well, they were quite successful in that because they brought a lot of stability to countries. And in fact, as we've seen with self-determination, created a hell of a lot of new European countries. Europe was one of the most stable places it had been in a very long time. But when coming to answer the question, we have to make sure we don't just say one viewpoint. And we can just get bogged down in kind of this viewpoint here, that the Treaty of Versailles was damaging and a horrible thing that happened and was the worst thing that had ever happened. And we've got a cartoon here which has the big four. You've got Lloyd George, Orlando, Woodrow Wilson and Clemenceau, and they're walking out of the peace conference, and over here it's not 100% clear. You've got a naked child with 1940 class above its head, and it's turned away and it's crying. And at the bottom, the tiger, which is Clemenceau, is saying, "Curious, I seem to hear a child weeping." So it's saying, this cartoon in 1920 by the Australian artist Will Dyson is saying, look, the Treaty of Versailles is completely damaging. It's going to ruin the future. And the children of 1940 are going to be naked, sobbing, crying, left hopeless, and everything's gone to hell. And that's kind of like the viewpoint that a lot of people accept, that it really was a main cause of World War II. And to an extent it was, because Hitler constantly used it as justification for the things he was doing, that he was destroying the Treaty of Versailles, that he was bringing fairness back to Europe. But we have to remember that we can't just slate the Big Three, and we can't just slate the people at the Paris Peace Conference and say what they were doing was completely unjustified, because in their eyes it was justified. They had a lot of pressure on them after World War One. It was the bloodiest war of all time. There was a lot of things that needed sorting out. And like we've said, it could have been a hell of a lot worse on the rest of Europe if certain leaders like Clemenceau had their way. In the end, and we have to remember this, the Treaty of Versailles, and I'm going to write it on big here, was a compromised peace. It was a compromised peace. And we have to be forming an opinion, but at the same time, when answering the question, were the treaties justified, look at lots of different reasons, and don't just go straight for the first one and say, no, it wasn't justified because it was damaging to Germany. Well, you know what? There were a lot of people that would say it was justified, and we have to consider their opinions as well. Just remember that, and you'll be fine. Thank you.